The world didn't go white when the third bullet hit me. It went quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a body deciding whether it still wants to fight. I could smell gunpowder cutting through the garlic and the wine, and the expensive cologne of men who would never bleed for anyone. I looked down. Not at my own chest. Not at the spreading warmth soaking through my green vest. I looked at the little girl underneath me. Her pink bow was still perfect. She was trembling, but she was whole. She was alive. Then a shadow swallowed the light above us. The most dangerous man in the room, maybe in the city, dropped to his knees on a floor that cost more than my mother's hospital bills. He wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at me. His jaw was tight. His eyes were something I didn't have a word for yet. He grabbed the nearest medic by the collar, and when he spoke, the entire room stopped breathing. She doesn't go to county. She goes to my hospital. My doctor. My room. He paused, his eyes still locked on mine as they started to close. And my wife doesn't wait in any line. I had never met this man before tonight. I didn't even know his name. New York doesn't notice you unless you're useful. For Amaka Ose, being useful meant a double shift at Gilded, the kind of restaurant where the bread costs more than her hourly wage and the guests look through you like you're part of the furniture. It was a Friday night, and her feet had stopped hurting 2 hours ago, which she knew from experience was not a good sign. When the pain goes quiet, the exhaustion has won. She had her mother's callback appointment at 8 a.m. She had $340 in her account, $290 of which was already spoken for. She had 3 tables left and a phone that kept buzzing with alerts from her mother's care facility, alerts she couldn't afford to read and couldn't afford to ignore. She was 26 years old, and she was already tired in the way that doesn't go away with sleep. Table 12 needs clearing. Move it, Ose. Her floor manager's voice crackled in her earpiece like static from another world. She moved. That was the job. Stay invisible. Clear the plate. Fill the glass. Disappear. The guests at Gilded didn't come to see the staff. They came to feel like the world was arranged entirely for their comfort, and Amaka's job was to maintain that illusion. She was refilling water at the corner booth when she noticed the little girl. Brown hair, pink bow, big dark eyes scanning the restaurant like she was searching for something familiar in a room full of strangers. She was maybe 6 years old, sitting beside a man in a black suit so precisely cut it looked engineered rather than sewn. The man had the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, it came from control. His eyes moved constantly. Not like a nervous man. Like a man who had learned long ago that danger never announces itself. Something about the little girl made Amaka slow down. She looked the way Amaka used to feel at that age, at her uncle's church functions, at school events, where everyone else seemed to know a language she hadn't been taught, present in the room, absent from the world. Amaka almost smiled at her. Then the lights flickered. And the man in the black jacket walked in from the side entrance, the one the staff used, moving too fast and too straight, his right hand tucked against his jacket in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Amaka knew every face on tonight's floor. She didn't know his. She set down the water pitcher. She didn't think about her mother's appointment. She didn't think about the $290 already spoken for, or the 3 tables still waiting, or the fact that she was wearing non-slip shoes with no grip and her back had been aching since Tuesday. She just ran. Gilded didn't close so much as it exhaled. By 10:15, the last of the dinner crowd was thinning, the lingerers nursing their final glasses of Bordeaux, the couples who had run out of things to say but weren't ready to go home and admit it. The kitchen had dropped to a low hum. The candles were burning down to their holders. And Amaka was on her third wind, which was the dangerous one, the one that felt like energy, but was really just the body running on fumes and refusing to acknowledge it. She cleared table 9 with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times, stacking plates without a sound, folding the linen with one hand, resetting the water glasses in a single fluid motion. Invisible. Efficient. Gone before anyone noticed she'd been there. Ose? Her floor manager's voice appeared in her earpiece like an unwelcome thought. Table 4's wine is sitting empty. You're not paid to stand around. She hadn't been standing around. She'd been moving without pause for 6 hours. But she said nothing because she never said nothing and turned toward table 4. Her phone buzzed against her thigh, the third time in 20 minutes. She didn't need to look at it to know. The care facility only called this late when something had shifted with her mother. Small shifts, the nurses always said, as if smallness made them easier to carry. Her oxygen was a little low. Her appetite was a little off. Her confusion was a little worse tonight. A little. A little. A little. It added up. Amaka would call back on her break. She had 11 minutes left of it. She would stand in the alley behind the kitchen where the delivery trucks parked, and she would listen to whatever the night nurse said, and she would say, "Thank you, I understand. Please call me if anything changes." And then she would come back inside and fill the wine and clear the plates and smile at people who didn't see her. She was good at that. Had been for years. She was passing table 12 when she saw the little girl. She almost didn't stop. She almost kept moving, the way you learn to when the shift is long and the floor manager is watching and every second of stillness has to be justified. But something made her slow. The child was maybe 6. Brown hair pulled back with a pink bow that sat slightly crooked, like she'd put it in herself and no one had fixed it. Her eyes were large and dark and moving carefully around the room, not with wonder, but with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned that new places can turn dangerous without warning. She wasn't looking at the chandeliers or the other diners or the gleaming silver on the table. She was looking for something safe. Beside her, a man in a black suit sat with his hands folded and his eyes never still. Amaka almost smiled at the little girl. Then the lights flickered. She saw him the same moment the room felt him. Not saw, registered. The way you register a sound that doesn't belong before your brain has named it. He came through the service entrance on the east wall, the one that stayed propped open between kitchen runs. Black jacket. Dark beanie pulled low. A face covering that left only his eyes, and his eyes were already locked on a target. He wasn't moving like a man who was lost. He wasn't moving like staff. Amaka's body understood before her mind caught up. She was already setting down the water pitcher carefully, quietly, the way she'd been trained, when she tracked the line of his gaze across the room. It didn't end at the man in the black suit. It ended at the little girl with the pink bow. The realization hit her like a door swinging open into her chest. They're not here for him. They're here for her. The nearest bodyguard was 3 steps behind, and already a second too slow, his hand moving toward his jacket as his eyes finally found the threat. 3 steps. 1 second. An eternity. Amaka ran. She wasn't built for sprinting across marble in non-slip work shoes, but she ran anyway, cutting between tables, one hand sweeping a guest's shoulder out of her path without apology. She heard the floor manager say her name into the earpiece like a question. She heard the first gasp from somewhere behind her, the crowd sensing the wrongness before they could see it. The gunman raised his arm. Amaka hit the little girl like a wave, not a tackle, a wrap, both arms pulling the child into her chest and turning her body hard so that her own back faced the room, faced him, faced whatever was coming. The first bullet found her left shoulder. It felt like being struck by something moving too fast to have a shape. The force torqued her sideways, but she didn't let go. She curled tighter around the girl, her arms making a cage of herself, her body a wall. The second bullet tore through her side. That one had heat in it. A burning that spread outward like spilled water. She was going down. She knew she was going down. She twisted as she fell so that she landed on her back, the girl pressed to her chest, shielded from the floor, shielded from the room, shielded from everything Amaka could still put between her and the world. The third bullet came as she hit the ground. Then there were hands, large, frantic, shaking hands that had probably never shaken before, pulling her away from his daughter. Rocco. She understood that was his name because someone was screaming it. He was on his knees beside her, his face close, his dark eyes wide with something that didn't belong on a face like his. It looked like devastation. Stay, he said, or maybe she only imagined it, because the chandeliers above her were blurring at the edges, the gold running into the white running into nothing. She had made sure the girl was safe. That was enough. That had to be enough. The ceiling was the first thing she understood. Hi. White. The kind of white that doesn't exist in places where money is a concern. Not the white of a hospital corridor or a rented apartment, but the white of a room where every surface has been considered. Where someone made a deliberate choice to put nothing that wasn't perfect. Amaka lay still and let her eyes move before her body tried to. Crown molding. A chandelier, small and warm, dimmed to almost nothing. Curtains the color of cream, heavy enough to hold back the world. On the bedside table, white roses in a vase so clear it looked like the stems were floating. She had never woken up anywhere that looked like this. The pain arrived a moment after the recognition, as if it had been waiting politely. It came from everywhere and from nowhere specific, a deep, installed ache that told her something fundamental had been rearranged inside her body and was still deciding how to settle. She turned her head. He was sitting in a chair that had been pulled close to the bed, not a hospital chair, a real one, dark wood and leather, the kind that belonged in a study. He was still wearing the black suit, though the jacket was gone now, his shirt open at the collar. His forearms rested on his knees. His eyes were already on her. He didn't smile. He didn't reach for her. He just said, quietly, "You're safe." Amaka's mouth was dry. Her voice, when it came, sounded like something borrowed. The girl. Sophia. Something moved across his face, not softness exactly, but a loosening. She's fine. She hasn't been hurt. Amaka closed her eyes for a moment. Let that land. Let it matter the way it needed to. Then she opened them again. I want to go home. I know. I have to call my mother's care facility. I missed the callback. I need to. It's been handled. He said it the way men like him said everything, like the sentence was already finished before it began. Your mother has been informed you're recovering. The facility has been contacted. There's nothing you need to do tonight. She stared at him. You had no right to do that. No, he agreed. He didn't apologize. I want to go home, she said again, because it was the only solid thing she had left to hold. Not yet. His voice didn't rise. It didn't soften either. It simply stayed, the way he stayed, immovable and without explanation. You're still in danger. When that changes, I'll tell you. From who? He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing something she couldn't see. Then he settled back in the chair, the leather creaking quietly beneath him. He didn't answer. He just stayed. And, somehow, in the silence of that impossible room, with its floating roses and its careful white ceiling, that was the most frightening thing he could have done. The estate didn't announce itself. That was the first thing Amaka noticed. No grand reveal, no moment where the car crested a hill and the house spread itself out for admiration. One moment there were trees, old ones, the kind that had been growing long before anyone thought to plant them decoratively, and then there were gates. Iron, tall, and completely still until they weren't. They opened without a sound, which was somehow worse than if they had groaned. The car rolled through and didn't stop for a long time. When the house finally came into view, it was large in the way that didn't need to prove anything. Stone and glass and clean lines, set back from the drive like it was accustomed to being approached carefully. No warmth in the architecture. No accident in it either. Every window was exactly where someone had decided it should be. Amaka noted the cameras. She noted the two men standing at the base of the entrance steps, hands clasped, eyes moving. She noted that the gates had already closed behind them. Inside, the floors were marble and the ceilings were high and the air smelled of something expensive and neutral, like a place that had been cleaned so thoroughly that all traces of living had been removed along with the dust. A man met them in the entrance hall, broad, pale, with close-cropped red hair and eyes that gave nothing away. He looked at Amaka the way you look at a variable in an equation you haven't solved yet. Caleb O'Connor, Rocco said, by way of introduction. Nothing more. Caleb nodded once. Not at Rocco. At her. Like he was filing her away. The woman appeared at the top of the staircase without being summoned. She was beautiful in the precise, deliberate way of women who understand that beauty is a language and have become fluent in it. Dark hair. A silk blouse the color of still water. She descended the stairs without hurrying, which told Amaka everything about how she wanted to be perceived. Her eyes moved over Amaka once, just once, and in that single pass communicated something that no amount of politeness and her eventual smile could contradict. "You do not belong here. This is Tina," Rocco said. His voice carried no particular tenderness. "Welcome," Tina said, and meant neither word. Then something small and fast came around the corner of the hallway and stopped just short of Amaka's wheelchair, and the temperature of the entire room changed. Sophia. Pink bow slightly crooked. Eyes wide and careful and achingly familiar. She didn't ask permission. She simply reached out and wrapped both hands around Amaka's fingers and held on, and did not let go. Later, when the house had settled into its evening silence, Amaka asked one of the staff where she might find the exit to the east garden. The woman smiled apologetically. "I'll have to check with Mr. Rocco." Amaka already knew what the answer would be. The gates didn't open. Not for her. Not yet. Tina came the next morning with orchids. Not roses, orchids, which lasted longer and were harder to kill and required a specific kind of attention that most people couldn't sustain. Amaka suspected this was not accidental. Tina did not appear to do anything accidentally. She set them on the windowsill herself, adjusting the pot twice until it caught the light at the angle she wanted, then settled into the chair across from Amaka's bed with the ease of a woman sitting in her own home. Which, Amaka reminded herself, she was. "You should have everything you need," Tina said, her voice smooth and temperate as a climate-controlled room. "But I wanted to check myself. The staff can be inattentive." "They've been fine," Amaka said. "Good." Tina smiled. It reached the correct muscles. Rocco can be excessive when he feels he owes someone. It's a quality that looks like generosity, but is really just accounting. He likes his debts settled. A small pause precisely waited. "I'm sure you understand." Amaka looked at her. "I understand you perfectly." Something shifted in Tina's expression, too fast to name, too controlled to be accidental. Then the smile returned, identical to the one before it. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing. About the orchids, about physical therapy, about the chef's tendency to oversalt. Tina was excellent at talking about nothing. Amaka was beginning to understand, a skill that required considerable intelligence to perform convincingly. When she left, the room felt both emptier and more crowded. An hour later, voices in the corridor drew Amaka's attention to the gap beneath the door. She recognized Caleb's measured cadence. The other voice she didn't know, looser, younger, with the particular confidence of a man who had never had to earn his place in a room. The door opened without a knock and a man leaned in, his eyes moving over Amaka with casual assessment. He had Tina's cheekbones and none of her discipline. "So you're the one," he said, like she was a rumor he was confirming. "Owen," Caleb said from behind him. A single word. Flat as a closed door. Owen smiled, unbothered. "Just introducing myself. We're practically family now." He looked at Amaka a moment longer than necessary, then disappeared back into the corridor. Amaka kept her face neutral. But she watched. Through the gap of the still open door she saw it, the look that passed between them when Owen turned back to Caleb. Not the look of a guard acknowledging a guest. Not the mild irritation of a professional managing an intrusion. Recognition. And beneath it, something that needed to stay hidden. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Caleb pulled the door shut. Amaka sat with the orchids Tina had positioned to catch the light, and she turned the moment over in her mind the way she turned everything carefully, quietly, without showing her hands. She didn't know what it meant yet. But she never forgot a face. And she never forgot a look. Sophia's fever arrived quietly, the way small disasters do. By 8 o'clock she was warm to the touch. By 9 she was restless, tangling herself in her sheets with a miserable persistence that broke something in Amaka just to watch. The staff had been called. Someone had taken her temperature, noted it was low grade, left a damp cloth and instructions for fluids, and moved on with the efficient detachment of people managing a household rather than caring for a child. Amaka waited 20 minutes for someone to come back. No one came back. She maneuvered herself out of bed with the slow, gritted teeth choreography that had become her nightly ritual, one hand on the nightstand, weight carefully distributed, the protest in her lower back noted and overruled. She took the wheelchair as far as the corridor, then made herself walk the remaining distance to Sophia's room, one hand trailing the wall, because some things required you to arrive on your own feet. Sophia looked up when she entered, her eyes glassy and relieved in the way of sick children who have been alone and suddenly aren't. "My head hurts," she said, as though reporting something she'd been saving. "I know, baby," Amaka said. "Move over." She sat on the edge of the mattress, and Sophia reorganized herself without ceremony, settling across Amaka's lap with the absolute trust of a child who had made a decision about a person and saw no reason to revisit it. Amaka found the damp cloth, refolded it to the cooler side, laid it gently across Sophia's forehead. Then she reached for the book on the nightstand, a picture book, worn at the corners, clearly beloved, and began to read. Softly. Not performing it, just offering it, the way you offer a hand in the dark, not knowing if it will be taken. Sophia's breathing began to slow within minutes. Amaka didn't stop reading when it did. She didn't notice the door. She didn't notice the light from the corridor falling across the floor in a long rectangle, or the shadow that appeared in it and then did not move. She was on the third reading of the same story Sophia had asked twice, and Amaka had simply turned back to the first page, when some instinct lifted her eyes. Rocco was standing in the doorway. He wasn't in the black suit. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, the kind of unguarded state a man like him probably allowed in very few rooms. He was looking at them, at his daughter's small body curved across Amaka's lap, at Amaka's hand resting in Sophia's hair, with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Not soft. It wasn't softness. It was something older and more complicated than that. Something that looked like a man recognizing, against his will, that a door inside him had been left open. He stood there longer than he meant to. Amaka saw it happen. She said nothing. She turned back to the first page again. The afternoons were the hardest hours. Morning had physical therapy to fill it, Helga's instructions, the parallel bars, the small humiliations and smaller victories of a body relearning itself. Evening had Sophia, who arrived at Amaka's door after her lessons with the reliability of weather, dropping her school bag and climbing onto the reading chair like she owned it, which in every way that mattered she did. But the afternoons were quiet. And quiet, Amaka had learned, was where the shooting lived. She didn't choose to replay it. It simply ran, the way a song lodges in the mind and plays without permission. The flicker of lights. The wrong movement in her peripheral vision. The moment her body made a decision her brain was still processing. She had learned not to fight it. She let it run its course and waited for it to finish, the way you wait out weather. Except today it snagged. She sat up straighter against her pillows. It snagged on a detail she had processed 100 times without seeing, a half-second she had filed under chaos and moved past. After the first bullet hit her shoulder, she had spun. The force had turned her body clockwise, and for one fractured moment before she went down she had been facing the room instead of the door. She had seen the shooter's eyes. And his eyes weren't on her. They weren't tracking to the exit. They moved deliberately, briefly, toward the bar on the north wall. Like a check. Like a confirmation. Like a man making sure someone was watching before he continued. Amaka closed her eyes and held the memory still, the way you hold a photograph to the light to find what you missed at normal distance. The bar on the north wall. Friday night, late seating, a room full of people dissolving into panic. One person not dissolving. He had been standing with a drink he wasn't touching, positioned at the bar's far end with a clear sight line to the dining floor. Dark jacket, silver at his temples, the kind of face that was accustomed to commanding rooms. She had seen him earlier in the evening speaking to Rocco with the easy familiarity of a man who didn't need to earn his place at the table. She didn't know his name then. She knew it now. She had heard it enough times in this house. Elias. Rocco's oldest friend. The man who visited with wine and warm stories and questions about how well she was sleeping. The man who had been calm, precisely, particularly calm, while every other person in Gilded was running or screaming or frozen in place. Amaka opened her eyes. The orchids on her windowsill caught the afternoon light. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, she could hear Sophia's voice and one of the staff laughing at something she'd said. She thought about what it would cost to be wrong. She thought about what it would cost to be right. She said nothing. Not yet. Elias arrived at 4 o'clock with a Barolo and a story about traffic that made the staff smile. That was the first thing Amaka noticed, how naturally he moved through the house, how the atmosphere shifted around him not with tension but with ease. He knew the housekeeper's name. He paused to admire something in the entrance hall he had probably admired 50 times before and made it feel genuine. He was the kind of man who had spent decades perfecting the art of being welcomed. He came to her room last, which was also deliberate. The woman of the hour, he said from the doorway, warm and unhurried, holding up the wine like an offering. I would have come sooner, but Rocco said you needed rest. I told him rest is for people with nothing better to think about. He smiled. It was an excellent smile. May I? Amaka gestured to the chair. He sat with the relaxed authority of a man who had never once in his life perched awkwardly anywhere. He asked about her shoulder, her mobility, the physical therapy. He asked about the food. Was the chef feeding her properly? She looked like she needed more than whatever Rocco considered an appropriate portion. He laughed at his own observation in a way that invited her to laugh with him. She smiled where smiling was required. The police, he said, conversationally, as though the thought had just arrived. Have they been difficult? I imagine they want a statement. Witnesses in situations like this, a small, sympathetic shake of the head, they never really consider what it costs a person to relive it. They've been fine, Amaka said. I haven't remembered much. Of course not. His voice was gentle. Trauma does that. Mercifully. He held her gaze a half-second longer than the sentiment required. The mind protects itself. It does, she agreed. She watched him the way she had learned to watch difficult tables, not directly, not obviously, but with the full attention of someone trained to notice what people needed before they asked for it. What Elias needed, she was understanding, was to know what she knew. He was here to take her temperature. To assess. To determine whether the woman Rocco had installed in his compound was a loose thread or a tied one. She gave him nothing. She gave it to him warmly, with steady eye contact and unhurried answers, which was more convincing than giving him nothing coldly. When he stood to leave, he pressed her hand between both of his and told her she was remarkable. He meant it as a test. She received it as a compliment. At the door he paused, just briefly, just once, and looked back at her. She was already looking at him. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. By the time his footsteps faded down the corridor, the terms had been established without a single word that could be repeated. The war had begun. She chose an evening when Sophia was asleep and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, when there were no staff in the corridors and no reason for anyone to be listening at doors. Rocco was in his study. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression shifted the way it always did when he saw her walking rather than in the chair, a brief, contained relief he would never acknowledge aloud. Amaka. He set down his pen. Sit down. I'd rather stand. She had learned that conversations with Rocco went differently when she was at eye level. She told him plainly. No preamble, no softening. The details she had caught. The hesitation after the first shot. The eyes moving not to the exit but to the bar on the north wall. The one person in the room who hadn't moved, hadn't panicked, hadn't done anything except stand with a drink he wasn't touching and watch. She told him the name she had put to the face. Elias. The study went very still. Rocco's expression didn't collapse. It didn't harden either. It did something more unsettling. It closed, the way a room closes when someone shuts every window at once. He was quiet for long enough that Amaka heard the clock on the shelf behind him marking the seconds. Elias has been beside me for 20 years, he said finally. I know. You were in shock. 3 bullets, blood loss. I know what I saw. You saw a crowded room in chaos, he said, and his voice was not unkind, which was almost worse than if it had been. You saw a man standing at a bar. That's not. He looked at the shooter, Rocco. Before the second shot. It wasn't a coincidence of direction. He looked at him. Rocco stood. He moved to the window and stayed there with his back to her, and Amaka understood that the conversation was over even though neither of them had said so. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We'll talk tomorrow." They both knew they wouldn't. She made her way back to her room alone, her hand trailing the wall, the pain in her back a low and steady companion. The corridor felt longer than it had before. The doors she passed felt less like doors and more like the closed faces of people who had already made their decisions. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and took inventory of what she had. No ally. No exit. A compound full of people whose loyalties she couldn't map, and one she could, which made her more dangerous to him than she had been yesterday. She had told the truth. She had told it to a man who wasn't ready to hold it. And somewhere in this house, or close enough to it, Elias already knew, the way people like him always knew, that something had shifted. She had just made herself a target. She had done it anyway. She woke to silence that was wrong. Not the settled quiet of a sleeping house, something thinner than that, something with an edge to it. Amaka lay still and listened the way she had learned to listen in this place, with her whole body rather than just her ears. No footsteps in the corridor. No creak of the guard rotation she had memorized without meaning to. Caleb made a particular sound on the hardwood outside her room at midnight and again at 2. She had clocked it within her first week without deciding to. It was past 2. She had heard nothing. She was reaching for the lamp when the window across the room moved. She was out of the bed before the frame finished opening, her body making the decision ahead of thought, the pain in her back irrelevant, overruled, filed away for later. She pressed herself against the wall beside the wardrobe and made herself small, and she watched. One man came through. Then another. They were not looking for a woman pressed against a wall. They were looking for a woman in a bed. The second one moved toward the bed with purpose, and Amaka was already through the connecting door, the one Rocco had told her never to lock, before he reached it. The corridor outside Rocco's room was chaos she arrived into rather than caused. 2 more men, a sound she didn't look toward, and then a door at the far end of the hallway swinging open and Sophia's voice rising into a scream that cut through everything. "Sophia." Amaka moved. She didn't reach her first. Rocco came from the darkness of the corridor like something that had been waiting in it. He was fast in the way that had nothing to do with size, controlled, absolute, purposeful. There were 3 men between him and his daughter. Then there weren't. Amaka pulled Sophia into her arms and turned her face away and held her, one hand pressed over the child's ear, her own cheek against the top of Sophia's head. She stood in the center of the hallway and did not move and did not look away from the door she needed to watch. When it was over, the house was quiet again, differently quiet, the kind that follows something irreversible. Rocco appeared in the doorway. His shirt was dark. His hands were dark. His breathing was measured in the deliberate way of a man who has trained himself not to let it show. His eyes found Sophia first. Then they found Amaka. She looked back at him without flinching, without stepping back, without rearranging her face into any of the expressions he probably expected, horror or fear, or the particular recoil of a person confronting what he actually was. She just looked at him. Something moved across his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not gratitude. Not relief. Recognition. Like a man who had been looking for something for a very long time and had stopped believing it existed. The truth, once it started moving, moved fast. Rocco didn't rage. That was the thing Amaka hadn't expected. She had braced for fury, for the particular violence of a powerful man discovering betrayal, and instead what she witnessed was something colder and more efficient than anger. He sat at his desk at 4 in the morning, and he made calls in a voice so level it was almost gentle, and by the time the sun came up the architecture of the conspiracy had been mapped to its foundations. Caleb first. Caleb, who had been at his post for 3 years and had never given anyone reason to look twice at him. Caleb, whose debt had been purchased quietly by Owen 6 months ago, medical, the kind that accumulates when someone you love is sick and the options narrow to nothing. Owen had bought his silence and then his cooperation, 1 degree of compromise at a time, the way these things always worked. Never a dramatic crossing of lines. Just a series of small steps, each one justifiable in isolation, until you looked back and couldn't see where you'd started from. Owen had been Elias's instrument. That was the brutal simplicity at the center of it. Owen, who wore his carelessness like a costume, had been precise enough when precision was required. He had fed Elias the schedule, the security rotation, the layout of the restaurant that Friday night. He had fed him everything, and all it had cost Elias was patience and the willingness to use a man's love for his sister as a door. Tina. Amaka thought about her orchids, carefully positioned to catch the light. She thought about the smile that reached the correct muscles. She thought about a woman who was either a victim of her brother's choices or a curator of her own ignorance, and understood that the distance between those two things was something only Tina could know, and that Tina would never say. Elias had wanted the territory. He had watched Rocco build it for 20 years and had decided that proximity was no longer enough. He had used a family connection like a key, inserted it carefully, and turned it. What he hadn't accounted for was a waitress who remembered everything. By mid-morning it was done, in the way that things were done in Rocco's world, completely and without remainder. Amaka didn't ask for the details and none were offered. She sat by the window in her room and watched the grounds and understood that somewhere beyond the iron gates, the balance of things had shifted irrevocably. Rocco appeared in her doorway at noon. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours, which he had. He looked like a man who had just burned down something he'd spent decades building in order to remove what was rotting inside it. He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her since the night before, like something had been confirmed that he hadn't dared put into words. This time, he didn't leave. He came at noon with an envelope. He set it on the table beside her chair without ceremony and sat across from her, his forearms on his knees, his eyes direct in the way they always were, like a man who had decided long ago that looking away was a form of dishonesty he couldn't afford. "It's done," he said. "The threat is gone. You're safe." Amaka looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "Your mother's facility," Rocco said. "The debt is cleared. The next 3 years of her care are arranged and paid. There's an apartment, good building, good neighborhood, a doorman who knows his job. Your name is on the lease." He paused. "You won't need to work doubles anymore. You won't need to count anything. Whatever you had before, you'll have more of it. Whatever you were afraid of losing, you won't lose it." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without decoration, as though the magnitude of what he was offering was simply a logistical matter being resolved. Amaka sat with it for a moment. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the window, where the grounds lay quiet in the noon light, the gates visible at the end of the long drive. "Open," he'd said. For the first time since she'd arrived, open. She looked at him. "Is that what you think I am to you?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. Rocco didn't answer immediately. He held her gaze, and she watched something move behind his eyes, not evasion, but the particular difficulty of a man reaching for a language he had never been taught, in a room where performance was no longer an option. The silence stretched long enough that a lesser version of this moment might have collapsed under it. It didn't collapse. "No," he said finally. His voice had dropped to something she had only heard from him in the dark, in doorways, in corridors, in the unguarded hours when the house was quiet and he forgot, briefly, to be what the world required of him. "That's not what you are." He leaned forward. Not reaching for her, just closing the distance between one honest thing and another. "Stay," he said. "Not because I owe you. Not because you're owed anything. A breath. Because I am different with you here. And I don't know how to go back to what I was before you walked into this house, and I don't think I want to." Amaka looked at this man, his empire cracked open, his oldest friend dismantled, his hands still bearing the evidence of what he was and what he would always be, and she understood that this was the truest thing he had ever offered anyone. Not protection. Not payment. Himself. She had spent her whole life giving without receiving, helping without asking, staying invisible so that others could be seen. She reached out and took his hand. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll stay." Outside, the gates were open. She didn't need them to be. And that is the story of how Amaka Ose went from invisible to unforgettable. She walked into Gilded that Friday night with tired feet and a phone full of alerts and 3 tables left on her shift. She walked out of it, carried out, if we're being exact, with 3 bullets in her body and a life she hadn't planned for waiting on the other side of the pain. But here is what I want you to hold on to when you think about this story. It wasn't the bullets that changed everything. It wasn't the ring, or the compound, or the man who turned out to be worth trusting. It was the moment before all of it, the split second where a woman who had every reason to keep her head down and her hands to herself looked at a little girl in danger and made a different choice. She didn't save Sophia because she knew who Rocco was. She didn't do it for the debt to be repaid or the life that would follow. She did it because she was the only person in that room still moving, and she decided that was enough of a reason. That is what made her extraordinary. Not the sacrifice itself, but the fact that she would have done it regardless of what came after. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to matter. Amaka never waited. She just never knew anyone was watching. Now you've watched. So I want to ask you something, and I want your honest answer in the comments below, because I read every single one. If you were standing where Amaka stood that night, tired, underpaid, 3 tables left on your shift, would you have moved? Or would you have frozen like everyone else in that room? There is no wrong answer. That moment was designed to freeze people. But I want to know what you think you would have done. And if this story reached something in you, if Amaka's dignity, or Rocco's slow unraveling, or Sophia's small hands holding on for dear life made you feel something real, then please hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it tells me to keep telling stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already and ring the bell because the next story is coming and I promise you it is worth showing up for. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. That means more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.